Hi, this is Tamara Nunes, and today we're going to be talking about DNS, which is Domain Name System. Okay, what is DNS? DNS is a domain name system or service, which is a TCP/IP facility that lets you use names rather than numbers to refer to host computers. What is TCP? TCP is Transmission Control Protocol, is what it stands for, and it's used to transport information from one computer to another. And then IP, which stands for Internet Protocol, is used to deliver packets to network devices, so that makes sense that we're going to be transmitting information from one place to another. IP, Internet Protocol, uses logical IP addresses, which an IP address is a number that uniquely identifies each computer or device that's connected to the internet. So everything, all of your devices that you have will have its own IP address. And an IP address consists of 4 groups of numbers, and they're each separated by a period. And IP also consists of a network part and a host part. So how does DNS work? DNS, like we said before, is a name service. It provides names to identify TCP/IP hosts, like www.amazon.com. So it would provide these IP addresses of the hosts, which Amazon, its IP address would be 207.171.182.16. So it's kind of similar to a phone book. Like, say for instance, you wouldn't have to remember that number. All you would do would be to type in that IP address, or the name rather, and then that would give you that IP address. Because it would be a lot easier to remember the Amazon.com than it would be to remember all those numbers. I can't even remember my phone number, much less that number. So that is good for us. DNS works on a hierarchical naming system using domains. So what is a domain? A domain is any part of a network address. All devices that share a part of a domain name are said to be in the same domain. So in www.google.com, Google would be the domain. And it would also be, a domain name is the text version of an IP address. So each domain includes all the names that appear directly beneath it in the hierarchy. The hierarchy goes like from the root to the country code, top level domain, and then you have a top level domain, and then you have subdomains. Not all IP addresses or web addresses are going to have a country code. That's just for places that are outside of your general area, like if you want to go to one in the Ukraine or Europe or Mexico, I don't know. But it's going to have an extra little, like after your .com, it's going to have a .mx for Mexico, or a .uk for Ukraine. So here's a graph of a little bit explaining what we just talked about the hierarchy. You've got your root, and then your top level domains are going to be your .gov, your .com, and your .edu. You've got your country code top level domain, which is up to your right. And I put an MX up here, which stands for the Mexico. And then down at the bottom, you see, like if you were going to google.com, it would go from your root to your .com, and then it would go down to your Google, which is in your Google domain. So then you would either be going to a server or a printer or someplace inside of your Google domain. Okay, here's a few little details about DNS names. DNS names are controlled by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is called ICANN. DNS names are not case sensitive, so you can type them in lowercase or capital, and it doesn't matter. The DNS tree can be up to 127 levels deep. There are certain things called fully qualified domain names, which are indicated by a trailing dot that represents the root domain. They're also called an absolute name, as opposed to a relative name, and they are unambiguous. You do have to purchase from a registrar your domain name, and some of those places are GoDaddy.com or 1and1.com. So if you're interested in purchasing a domain for a website yourself. So now that we've talked a little bit about DNS and explained the terminology, let's see how it works for us on the internet. So, how DNS is used. If you want to go to the website google.com, the computer sends a message to the DNS server to see if it has the address. The DNS server, which is also called a name server, manages a massive database that maps domain names to the IP addresses. They use these servers for websites, email, printing over network, things like that. The server then will find your domain name, which is also called DNS name resolution. The DNS server resolves the domain name to the IP address. If you don't want to use a DNS server, you can, like we talked about before, just type in the IP address directly. Most people are not going to know the IP address. I don't know an IP address to anything. Okay, so DNS servers, we talked a little bit about the root. That's the very top level of the hierarchy. It stores a database of the internet domain names and IP addresses. There's only 13 that are really famous, and 10 of those exist in the U.S. The system is distributed, which means the lower levels only have a fraction of the information that these root servers do, because the root servers have everything. Lower levels are usually owned by businesses or internet service providers. Like, for instance, Google, they maintain many servers around the world because they have companies all over the world. And then your individual internet service providers have DNS servers as part of their connection setup, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. DNS networking is a client-server architecture. The web browser could be a DNS client, or resolver is also called. It issues a request to your internet service provider DNS server when it's going to websites, so that means it's going to be a client. So if the server doesn't have that information and it has to transfer that information to another DNS server, it becomes a client. So if that server that it sends the information to doesn't have the information on that particular server, that server then becomes a client, just like your web browser, and sends it to another DNS server asking it for the information. So here's a diagram of how this kind of works. So on this particular diagram, we're going to cisco.com, and step 1, you would type that into your browser, and then it would go to your internal DNS server, which is what is like already programmed into your computer, and that sends it to the root level domain servers. And then if it doesn't have the information, it goes to the top level domain server, the .com or .edu, that whatever it is in your web address, and then that would send it down to the second level domain if it doesn't have the information. Once they get to a server that has that information, then it'll send it back to, because every time that information passes from server to server, they let it know where it needs to send that information back. So once it gets to the server that has the information, it'll send it back to your computer or your ISP or whatever, wherever this information comes from, and then you'll get it on your computer. Now just think, all this happens like within a blink of an eye. You know how fast it takes for you to get, like, from, when you type in google.com, how long it takes for you to get that web page. So this is what the computer is doing after you type in that information. Okay, so your DNS servers and your home networking. Computers on a home network locate your DNS server through your setup. The providers give the customers your public IP addresses for your primary servers and your backup servers. And then to be able to find your current IP addresses and your DNS server configuration, you can go to your configuration screen of your home network router. You can log onto your router and look on there, and it'll give you the information. You can go to your Windows control panel and look at your TCP IP connection properties. Or you can use your command line interface and type in ipconfig, and that's going to give you all of your DNS server information. So to sum it all up, without DNS, surfing the internet would be much more challenging, if we had to remember all of those IP addresses and numbers. And just think, it's just like having an integrated phone book right in your computer. And I thank you for listening.